In a cave in Belgium, scientists found the shattered bones of 6 people. Cut marks, snapped femurs, the same butchery patterns you would expect on a hunted animal, carved into the same places where a hunter would break a bone to get at the marrow inside. But these were not animal bones. They belonged to Neanderthals. And when researchers finally extracted DNA from the fragments, decades after they were first pulled out of the ground, they found something that turned a gruesome discovery into a chilling pattern. Almost every single victim was a woman. This is the story of what ancient DNA has revealed about Neanderthal women. And it is not a gentle story. It is a story pieced together from broken bones, fossilized teeth, and fragments of genetic code that have survived for tens of thousands of years, waiting for someone with the right tools to finally read them. For most of the 20th century, we had almost nothing to go on. Neanderthal women were essentially invisible in the fossil record, overshadowed by dramatic reconstructions of brutish, spear-wielding Neanderthal men. But over the last 2 decades, genetics has done something archaeology alone never could. It has let us look inside the bodies of individual Neanderthal women and ask very specific, very personal questions. Who were their parents? Where did they come from? Who did they mate with? And, in some deeply unsettling cases, how did they die? The place to start is a limestone cave system in Wallonia, in southern Belgium, called Goyet. Archaeologists first explored Goyet in the late 19th century, and for more than 100 years, the site was known mostly as a rich source of Neanderthal remains, more than 100 bone fragments in total. What made those fragments strange, even back then, was the condition they were found in. Many of them carried marks eerily similar to the butchery marks found on animal bones at the same site, cuts consistent with skinning, fractures consistent with extracting bone marrow, patterns of breakage that did not look like the aftermath of an accident, a fall, or a natural death. They looked like the aftermath of someone processing a body for food. For a long time, that was where the story stalled. The remains were too fragmentary, too degraded for anyone to say much more than that. It took new tools, developed over the past decade, to finally push past that wall. Researchers used ancient DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating, isotopic measurements of the collagen preserved in the bone, and detailed virtual reconstructions of the fragments to rebuild a picture of exactly who these 6 individuals were. What they found was not a random assortment of unlucky victims. It was a strikingly specific group. 4 of the 6 were adult or adolescent females, and their bones showed something unusual, an exceptionally short stature and unusually light, gracile long bones that set them apart from both the local Neanderthal population and other Neanderthal groups studied elsewhere in Europe. The remaining 2 individuals were a young child and a newborn boy. Think about that composition for a moment. 4 small, physically slight women, none of them closely related to each other according to the DNA, alongside 2 very young children. Researchers who studied the isotope signatures in their bones, the chemical fingerprint left behind by years of eating a particular diet in a particular place, found that these women shared a diet and an origin that was distinct from the local Neanderthals living in the area. In other words, these were outsiders. They had grown up somewhere else, eating different food, and at some point they ended up at Goyet, where they were killed and eaten. The lead researcher on the study, a biological anthropologist from the University of Bordeaux, put it plainly when the findings were published. The composition of the group, 4 adult females and 2 immature individuals, was simply too specific to be an accident. This was not a case of a family group dying together from illness or exposure and later being scavenged. This looked like a targeted act, and the target was a very particular kind of victim, women from another group, along with children. That detail, the fact that the victims were outsiders and not locals, connects to something else genetic research has been uncovering about how Neanderthal societies were actually structured. For years, anthropologists have debated whether Neanderthal groups were petrolocal, meaning the men stayed with the group they were born into while women moved to join a new group when they reached adulthood, or matrilocal, on the opposite arrangement, which is actually the more common pattern among many later hunter-gatherer societies. Genetic work at another site, El Sidran in Spain, gave us one of the clearest answers we have. Researchers there found that the male Neanderthals buried together were closely related to each other, sharing Y chromosome lineages passed down through the paternal line. The women at the same site, however, carried much more diverse mitochondrial DNA, the kind of genetic material passed only from mother to child. That pattern is exactly what you would expect if the men in a group grew up together, generation after generation, in the same territory, while the women arrived from elsewhere, each bringing her own distinct maternal lineage with her. Put simply, Neanderthal women were, in many groups, the ones who left home. They were the ones who crossed into unfamiliar territory, joined a group of strangers, and had to build a life among people who were not their own blood relatives. And if that was the general pattern across Neanderthal Europe, it changes how we should read what happened at Goyet. If women were regularly moving between bands to find mates, then a group of outsider women traveling together or living together after having joined a neighboring group would have represented something specific and valuable to a rival community. Not just extra mouths to feed, but a rival group's capacity to reproduce, to have children, to continue existing into the next generation. Researchers studying the Goyet remains have argued that this is exactly what makes the case for a deliberate, targeted act of violence, rather than a random tragedy so compelling. If a group of Neanderthals wanted to weaken a rival community in the most effective way possible, killing the women who could have borne the next generation, along with their children, would have done exactly that. It would not just have been an act of violence, it would have been a strike aimed at erasing another group's future. Scientists call this pattern exocannibalism, the deliberate targeting and consumption of individuals from an outside group, as opposed to eating members of your own community after they died naturally, which some researchers believe may have carried a different, more ritual meaning in certain Neanderthal cultures. The timing of the Goyet killings adds another disturbing layer to the story. The remains date to somewhere between 45,000 and 41,000 years ago, a period when Neanderthal populations across northern Europe were already showing real signs of biological and cultural strain. Groups were becoming more fragmented, more genetically isolated from each other, and increasingly diverse in their tool-making traditions, a sign that populations were shrinking and losing contact with neighboring bands. At the very same time, early groups of Homo sapiens were beginning to move into the same landscapes that Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. It was, in other words, a moment of enormous pressure. It helps to picture what that migration actually meant on a human level, not just a genetic one. A young Neanderthal woman coming of age in one small, tightly bonded band would, at some point, have had to leave everyone she had ever known. Her parents, her siblings, the handful of adults who had raised her, all left behind, while she walked into unfamiliar territory to join a group of people who shared none of her history and very little of her blood. There would have been no guarantee of a warm welcome. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies today consistently find that incoming individuals, especially women marrying into a new group, often occupy a precarious social position for years, sometimes for life, treated with suspicion, given less say in group decisions, and viewed as replaceable in a way that women born into the group are not. There's no reason to think Neanderthal bands, under similar pressures of scarcity, would have been any gentler about it. If anything, the extreme isolation many Neanderthal groups experienced toward the end of their existence likely made outsiders even more conspicuous and even more expendable when resources ran short or conflict broke out. That vulnerability becomes especially important once you consider how small Neanderthal populations actually were. Genetic estimates consistently suggest that individual Neanderthal bands numbered only in the dozens, with the broader regional population fragmented into a patchwork of small, semi-isolated groups scattered across Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. In a world like that, a woman who left her birth group to join another had almost nowhere else to turn if that new group turned hostile. There was no wider tribe to appeal to, no distant relatives a day's walk away who might intervene. Once she crossed into a new band's territory, her safety depended almost entirely on how that band chose to treat her. The women found at Goyet, according to the isotope evidence, were living together, sharing a diet and an origin distinct from the locals, which suggests they had already been displaced once, perhaps captured or absorbed from a neighboring group, before they met the fate that left their bones scattered across that cave floor. In a very real sense, their vulnerability as outsiders may have been what got them killed in the first place, and it was very likely the same vulnerability rooted in the same patriarchal system that had brought them to that unfamiliar territory to begin with. It would be easy to stop the story there, with Goyet standing as proof that Neanderthal life could be brutally violent, particularly toward women who found themselves outside the protection of their birth families. But the genetic record has more to say, and some of it complicates the picture in ways that are just as unsettling, even without a single drop of blood spilled in anger. In 2026, a team of researchers led by geneticists at the University of Pennsylvania published a study in the journal Science that re-examined one of the oldest puzzles in human genetics, a puzzle that has nothing to do with cannibalism and everything to do with what happened in the bedroom, so to speak, between Neanderthals and early modern humans. Scientists have known for years that most people whose ancestry traces outside Africa carry a small amount of Neanderthal DNA, usually somewhere between 1 and 2% of their total genome. That DNA is not spread evenly across our chromosomes, though. On the X chromosome specifically, Neanderthal genetic material is almost entirely absent, forming what researchers have nicknamed a Neanderthal desert. For more than 2 decades, the leading explanation for that desert was a biological one. Scientists assumed that certain combinations of Neanderthal and modern human genes on the X chromosome caused fertility problems or health issues in the resulting offspring, and that natural selection had spent tens of thousands of years quietly weeding those combinations out of the human gene pool. It was a tidy explanation, and it fit with what we know about how genetics can punish certain hybrid combinations between closely related species. The new study offered a very different answer, one rooted not in biology gone wrong, but in behavior. The research team, led by geneticist Alexander Platt, working alongside senior author Sarah Tishkoff, analyzed 3 high-quality Neanderthal genomes and compared them against modern African genomes that never mixed with Neanderthals at all. What they found flipped the old assumption on its head. The X chromosomes belonging to the Neanderthals in their sample contained about 60% more Homo sapiens DNA than the Neanderthals' other non-sex chromosomes did. In other words, the genetic mixing was not symmetrical. It looked as though Neanderthal men were mating with Homo sapiens women far more often than Neanderthal women were mating with Homo sapiens men. Why would that produce a Neanderthal desert on the modern human X chromosome instead of a modern human desert on the Neanderthal X chromosome? Because of how X chromosome inheritance works. When a Neanderthal father and a Homo sapiens mother had a son together, that son inherited his only X chromosome entirely from his mother, meaning none of his father's Neanderthal genetic material on the X chromosome would ever be passed down at all. Multiply that pattern across many generations of unions, skewed overwhelmingly in one direction. Neanderthal men with human women rather than the reverse. And you end up with exactly the pattern researchers observe today. A human genome that is almost entirely missing Neanderthal ancestry on the X chromosome, not because that ancestry was harmful and selected against, but because it was structurally unable to be passed down in large amounts in the first place. Platt has been openly skeptical of the older theory for years. He has said publicly that he never cared for the long-standing idea that modern humans have simply been shedding harmful Neanderthal ancestry for the last 45,000 years. His alternative explanation, that ancient mating patterns themselves produced the desert, offers a cleaner fit for the data, but it also opens up a much darker set of questions. Because once you accept that Neanderthal men and Homo sapiens women were the primary pairing across these 2 populations, you have to ask why. And nobody, not Platt, not Tishkoff, not any other researcher working on this problem, can currently answer that question with any confidence. Sarah Tishkoff herself has been careful and, frankly, unsettling about how she frames the uncertainty. She has said there is simply no way to know for certain whether these encounters represented some kind of conflict scenario, raids in which Neanderthal men captured or abducted Homo sapiens women, or whether the pairings were peaceful, the product of choice, cooperation, or simple proximity between 2 populations sharing overlapping territory for thousands of years. She has pointed out that we do not know why this particular pattern emerged, whether it reflected the choices of the women involved, or whether those women were forced into these unions, and she has said that answering that question may require entirely new archaeological or fossil evidence that simply does not exist yet. Species, and concluded that they genuinely cannot rule out the possibility that a meaningful portion of those unions were the result of violence, abduction, or coercion, rather than mutual choice. The DNA can tell us who mated with whom, and roughly how often and in which direction. It cannot tell us what it felt like to be one of those women. Unsurprisingly, once this study hit the news cycle, a lot of headlines took the more comfortable interpretation and ran with it. Major outlets described Neanderthal men as prehistoric romantics, framed the findings as evidence of ancient attraction, and painted a picture of curious, courageous human women venturing out to fall in love with Neanderthal partners. Some of that framing produced genuinely charming headlines. It also, according to a number of scientists who pushed back publicly in the weeks that followed, badly oversold what the paper actually demonstrated. Critics pointed out that the genetic signal at the heart of the study traces back to an extremely ancient episode, one dated to roughly 250,000 years ago, long before the more famous, more recent waves of interbreeding that left the small Neanderthal contribution present in most non-African genomes today. They also pointed to an inconvenient wrinkle in the data. If Homo sapiens women had been regularly and repeatedly joining Neanderthal groups over a long stretch of time, you would expect to see a recent ongoing genetic signal of that mixing showing up in the very last Neanderthal populations before their extinction. Instead, the available Neanderthal genomes show no such recent contribution. Whatever mixing produced the X chromosome desert appears to have been an old, possibly one-time event, or a narrow window of contact, rather than an ongoing, centuries-long pattern of intermingling between neighboring friendly populations. That distinction matters enormously for how we should interpret the human side of this story. A single ancient episode of interbreeding, concentrated in a narrow window of time, is far more consistent with a specific, isolated event, a moment of contact between 2 small, non-local groups meeting unexpectedly, than it is with a long, gradual generations spanning courtship between 2 coexisting communities. It does not prove violence, but it does not support the tidy love story either, and several scientists have said so explicitly, arguing that ancient DNA on its own can reflect social rules, forced migration, group conflict, or basic biology just as easily as it can reflect romantic attraction, and that we should be deeply cautious about assuming the most flattering interpretation simply because it makes for a better headline. There's a third genetic case worth including here, because it adds yet another dimension to what we know about the pressures Neanderthal women faced. Pressures that had nothing to do with violence from outsiders and everything to do with the shrinking, isolated nature of their own communities. In 2010, researchers sequenced the genome of a Neanderthal woman whose remains were recovered from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. What they found inside her own DNA was almost as startling as anything uncovered at Goyet. Her parents, it turned out, were extremely closely related to each other, far beyond what would be considered typical, even within small, isolated populations. The relationship was consistent with an aunt and a nephew, a grandparent and a grandchild, or even two half-siblings. By almost any standard, that level of relatedness qualifies as incest. Her genome also revealed something else. She belonged to an extremely small breeding population, probably numbering fewer than 100 individuals in total. For a species already struggling with fragmented, isolated bands scattered across an enormous continent, a population that small would have left individuals with very few options when it came to finding an unrelated mate. That scarcity likely pushed some Neanderthal communities toward exactly the kind of close inbred pairings recorded in this woman's own DNA, a genetic signature of a species running out of room to maneuver, biologically speaking, in the final tens of thousands of years before its extinction. It is worth stepping back here and asking what all three of these threads, the Goyet cannibalism, the X chromosome desert, and the extreme inbreeding recorded in the Altai genome, actually add up to when you put them side by side. None of them, on their own, proves that Neanderthal women lived lives defined entirely by violence and coercion. Ancient DNA is a powerful tool, but it is not a video camera. It cannot show us intention, emotion, or the texture of daily life. It can only show us the biological aftermath of decisions and events that happened tens of thousands of years ago, and it leaves enormous gaps for interpretation, gaps that responsible scientists are quick to point out, even as journalists and video essayists, understandably, rush to fill them with more dramatic narratives. But taken together, these findings do paint a picture, and it is a picture worth sitting with honestly rather than sanitizing. It is a picture of Neanderthal women who, in many communities, were expected to leave their birth families behind and integrate into groups of relative strangers. It is a picture in which that same pattern of female mobility may have made outsider women, and by extension their children, uniquely vulnerable targets when tensions between rival bands spilled over into violence, as apparently happened at Goyet. It is a picture in which the very asymmetry preserved in our own genomes today, the strange absence of Neanderthal ancestry on the human X chromosome, likely reflects a deeply lopsided pattern of interbreeding between Neanderthal men and Homo sapiens women, one that scientists studying the data cannot confidently describe as either peaceful or forced, and are honest enough to admit they may never be able to resolve. And it is a picture in which, in at least some corners of the Neanderthal world, populations had shrunk so small and grown so isolated that women were bearing children with their own close relatives, simply because there was no one else left to choose. It is also worth pausing on how differently these two major findings, the Goyet cannibalism and the X chromosome desert, have been received by the public. The cannibalism study, gruesome as it is, was reported fairly consistently as a story of violence because the physical evidence, cut marks, broken bones, deliberate butchery, leaves very little room for a softer reading. Nobody rushed to describe the Goyet killings as some kind of ancient romance. But the interbreeding study, despite senior researchers themselves openly acknowledging the possibility of coercion, was frequently repackaged by the media into something closer to a feel-good story, all Neanderthal Romeos and prehistoric attraction, with the darker unresolved possibility mentioned only in passing, if it was mentioned at all. That gap between what the data supports and what audiences were told says something about how we process ancient history. Violence against faceless individuals from tens of thousands of years ago is easier to accept when it happens quickly and visibly, in one dramatic episode like a cave full of butchered bones, than when it is diffuse and encoded quietly into the statistical patterns of an entire genome. A skewed pattern of interbreeding, sustained across many generations, if it did involve coercion, would represent a far larger, longer-running harm than any single violent event. Yet it is the one story that got softened into something almost charming by the time it reached most readers. None of this means Neanderthal life was uniquely cruel compared to early Homo sapiens communities living through the same period, under many of the same pressures, in the same unforgiving Ice Age landscapes. Human prehistory, across every hominid species we have ever studied, is full of violence, scarcity, and hard choices that we, looking back from the comfort of the present, find difficult to fully understand. What makes the Neanderthal case feel different is simply that we finally have the tools to see it clearly, written into the bones and the DNA of specific individuals, rather than buried in vague speculative reconstructions. We can name the fact that 4 short, gracile women and 2 children were killed and eaten at a cave in Belgium 45,000 years ago, not by an unknown, faceless process, but very likely by a group of Neanderthals who saw them as outsiders and treated them accordingly. We can see, encoded directly into the chromosomes of billions of people, alive today, the ghost of a mating pattern between 2 human species that was almost certainly not symmetrical, and that may not have been consensual in any modern sense of that word. And we can see, in the DNA of a single woman from a cave in Siberia, just how narrow and desperate the choices available to some Neanderthal communities have become in the final chapter of their existence. Ancient DNA does not lie, but it also does not explain itself. It hands scientists a puzzle made of fragments, chemical signatures, and statistical patterns, and it leaves the interpretation, the story we choose to tell about what those fragments mean, entirely up to us. For decades, that story left Neanderthal women almost completely out of the picture, background figures in a narrative dominated by tools, weapons, and the men who supposedly wielded them. The genetic evidence gathered over the last 20 years has forced a correction to that story, and it has not been a comfortable one. It has shown us women who move between hostile, unfamiliar groups as a matter of routine, women who may have been the primary targets of one of the darkest, most deliberate acts of violence found anywhere in the Neanderthal archaeological record. Women whose genetic legacy in modern humans may trace back to encounters we cannot confidently call anything other than ambiguous and possibly violent, and women whose own bodies carried the biological cost of populations stretched so thin that even the most basic rule against mating with close family had, in some communities, quietly broken down. There's one more thing worth carrying away from all of this, something easy to miss beneath the shock value of butchered bones and skewed chromosomes. Every one of these findings exists only because ancient DNA technology has advanced far enough to pull a coherent story out of material that, 20 years ago, scientists would have had no way to read at all. A handful of degraded bone fragments in a Belgian cave, a few strands of genetic code preserved inside a Siberian cave for tens of thousands of years. A statistical asymmetry buried inside 3 ancient genomes, invisible without the computing power and sequencing methods developed only within the last decade. The fact that we can now reconstruct the ancestry, family relationships, and even likely cause of death of individual Neanderthal women who died more than 40,000 years ago is, on its own, a genuinely remarkable achievement. It just happens that what this new capability has revealed, so far, is a story far darker than the simple, cartoonish picture of Neanderthal life most of us grew up with. As sequencing technology keeps improving, and as more sites like Goyet and El Sidran get the same rigorous treatment, this picture will likely keep shifting, revealing still more about the women whose lives and deaths were quietly written into their bones all along, waiting tens of thousands of years for someone to finally read them.